Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd Service Fabric Community Q&A. Put your questions in the chat window, or if you like, you can actually ask live on your microphone, and we'll get your questions answered.
Yep, and as always, no question is too big or too small. If you've just used Service Fabric this morning, or you've been using it for
Years.
3 years,
3 years. Yeah, 3 years.
you know, anything goes in this thing. So we welcome all, new and old, fresh and old. That's a pretty cool way to
We get fresh and mature.
Just ask some
Yeah.
Please ask questions so Mark stops talking.
Yeah, first congrats on open source.
All right.
Yay.
Oh, yes.
We did it.
We might want to hear so.
Yes, and if you're on the call and you don't know yet, we're open source.
Yep. So we open source the majority of the code base.
Just about everything, yeah. So we're almost there. We're at a point now where you can go and of course build the whole thing for Linux, and we're still kind of working on getting the Windows environment set up out to GitHub. But pretty much all of it's there, and we'll be moving pretty fast to get everything, plus the team out there too.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big change, is when we start doing all the development in the open as well.
Yeah.
That's going to be fun.
Oh, that's a link.
Yes, yeah, add a link to that. And that's going to take a few months.
It'll take a few months, but we're happy to answer any questions about it here. If you're curious about the roadmap or how we're planning to operate or anything like that, feel free to ask, and we'll try to answer those as best as we can.
Nice crowd this morning.
Yeah.
Usually we start getting bombarded immediately. I think everyone's in shock.
Yeah.
Probably all
Well,
maybe we're trying to compile still.
Yeah,
Yes. I mean, we did post our announcement, a little bit late.
that's true.
It's always the third Thursday of every month, but I think that meant.
Yeah, maybe not as many people had a chance to pencil it into their calendars. Yeah,
Digested.
I know I wouldn't remember if a calendar invite didn't appear on my calendar automatically. So.
Yeah.
Marcin said he was going to be back at his PC, where I presume he has a notepad of questions handy, ready to dump into the chat window. And thank you, Maxime, for your help as well. I do appreciate it. Yeah. So fun stuff. Can we?
Fun stuff. What kind of fun stuff we got?
So what isn't in the repo yet? So
good question. So what isn't in the repo? So we don't have tools for building on Windows, obviously. We did. I think we were able to get basic tests up for Linux that you can run, and that's the next thing that we're working on now, is mainly getting the test infrastructure.
like the CIT level stuff.
Yeah, and then the other big thing that's missing right now too is all the .NET. Anything managed or .NET isn't up there yet because we can't get that to compile just yet. So we're still working on build tools for .NET Core. So
Stuff compiles on Windows but not on Linux, but the rest of the
Exactly.
Windows tools aren't up yet, so
Yeah,
hence no managed stack.
it's a work in progress. So like reliable collections, for example, we're still trying to get that up there because we wouldn't be able to build it up if we wouldn't be able to build it if we put it up there now.
Yeah.
So the managed reliable collections are still on their way. There's just some build issues we have to work through in order to get that up. But other than that, pretty much everything is there. I mean, what is like 96, 97% of the code base is all C++. It's all cross-compile. So and that's the thing. It's we only have Linux build tools, but it's the same code base for Linux and Windows. It's just build scripts and a couple extra pieces that you need for Windows versus Linux. But otherwise, it's the same thing. So if you build it for Linux now, or if you make changes or code fixes, they'll apply to both Linux and Windows.
Right.
It's just you can't
It's
test
not
it on
like
Windows.
it's not like the failover manager is different between the two environments.
It's the same
like that.
thing. Yeah,
The
exactly.
the majority of the code is all the same.
Right. So yeah, I mean it's pretty much all out there.
Well, let's start off. There's a few questions here then. So question one is it possible to mix Windows and Linux nodes in the same cluster?
Not presently. It's something that we did prototype, but it's several months out. So the recommendation is, to run your Windows containers, or your Windows workloads, run it on a Windows cluster. Your Linux workloads, run it on a Linux cluster. And talk to them, through REST or just like a generic endpoint.
Yeah, and I think that the main thing that's holding us up at this point is the the secure communication between Windows and Linux, because when we did it in Windows, we used Windows primitives, and making that interoperate with Linux was hard, so we have to go back and put SSL in everywhere. And that's just taking a little bit of time, and we need to make sure that we can do it in an upgradable fashion as well, so that's a little tricky.
Yeah.
But it's coming. That is something that we do intend you to be able to do.
All right. Someone else a little bit about open source. I think if I sort of described that, we could dive into
Yeah,
a bit more.
Yeah, feel free to ask more questions though too.
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there's a quiet time, just yell them out.
Yeah.
I remember some time ago it was mentioned that there'll be a viewer for persistent state incorporated in Service Fabric Explorer. What's happened there? Has it been worked on?
So that's still coming. The one that you saw, that demonstration, was really an OData piece of middleware that got shimmed into the ASP.NET stack as middleware. And then the viewer inside of SFX was just pulling those OData queries out and displaying the stuff. It is already open source, that basic pattern. We can point you to that repo. And SFX itself is now also open source. So you could go ahead and use it today. We just haven't really formally shipped that model. What we're also trying to do is get a more generic pattern that doesn't depend on, say, the ASP.NET middleware pipeline that isn't necessarily OData specific, that would work on things like backups that you may have taken. So you could, look at a backup that you took, fix some data, and then restore it into another service. That's really the full set of tools that we're working on getting done. I don't have a timeline yet for when that's actually going to ship, but that is something that we're still working on. In the meantime, the OData base one and SFX should get you part of the way if that's something that you like being able to poke around with. It's definitely better than nothing, and it beats writing your own kind of HTTP endpoints for everything. So that's what I'd recommend you do in the meantime if you want that sort of interaction.
Yeah, and I posted a link to where the OData crew.
Where Jesse's is? Okay.
Yes.
So Marcin asks, can you say something about the TStore architecture? So TStore is the type store. It's the store that sits underneath the reliable collections, kind of in between the reliable collections dictionaries and queues that you see and the actual log, which is basically like any other transaction log or data log. That's really underneath the collections. It's not much more than that conversion between the types that are provided at the collection level and that log structured store. That's where some of the connections are. It's kind of what we would internally call the state manager, which is kind of the state manager API that we give you. You can think of TStore as fundamentally the state manager. So that's where all that interaction sits. That's where you get some of the serialization stuff happens. That's where kind of the mark and sweep and garbage collection stuff happens. It's really kind of that hub where that translation goes on. We're trying to, as a part of the open source now, a lot of these things are out there, and what we really need to do is spend some time writing down better descriptions of them and putting them next to the code so that people can get a sense of the architecture and how these things all fit together without having to trawl through 2 million lines of C++ on their own.
Yeah, we're hoping to start publishing more kind of architectural guides, white papers, and also do some videos that are essentially just whiteboarding sessions where we walk through some of the more complex parts of the system. So
yeah,
those will start trickling out over time once we get a chance to actually do them.
But yeah, TStore and a bunch of other stuff, we'll talk about them in more detail in these sorts of presentations, which I do hope we get to do more of, because there's a lot in there to talk about.
So this is a good question for Maxim. What was so complicated about the Windows build process that it's coming late? So I mean, like most big software companies, we have a team that's just dedicated to building out a build pipeline. And the build pipeline does a bunch of things that we do for just kind of for consistency across products. So they build out a lot of custom tools. So we have a build system that has all these custom MS build tasks and a whole bunch of custom tooling around it. None of this stuff is available publicly, obviously, and they're not common tools. And so we build, close to, what, 3 million lines of code all embedded in the system. So picking that stuff out one by one is a pretty time-consuming thing. We did the same thing when we open sourced the reliable services and actors programming models. Basically the CS projects in those, they had all these custom MS build tasks that you couldn't even load the project into Visual Studio because Visual Studio would explode going, I don't know what these things are. You'd have to open up a command line, a command shell. You'd run some scripts that kind of bootstrap a build environment and a bunch of environment variables, and then you could launch the CS project through that command shell, and that would populate all these things and kind of tie it into this build system. So none of that stuff works, of course, unless you have access to these tools, which outside of the company nobody does. We actually did a little bit of this on the Linux side too. For example, we had to make some modifications to Clang in order to be able to build the 3 million lines of C++ for Linux within, like, a reasonable time frame, like less than a week. And so we actually, that one was okay though, because Clang is a public tool, and we were able to just fork that project and pull in those modifications, which was fine. We had to do a little bit of work around that before we could open source that side too. But on the Windows side, it's a lot harder because there's a lot more stuff in there that we gotta go and transition
Tease
to.
apart, tease the ability to build Service Fabric away from all of these internal build tools, or figure out what the replacements are, and then once you have the replacements, you have to make sure that they work and produce the same code base, right?
If you remember when .NET, .NET Core, and all these things, when they went open source back in like 2014, they had actually been working on pretty much what we're doing right now. They'd already spent a couple of years just teasing all that stuff out and trying to get it to a point where you could build it publicly. That was, just one of the things they were trying to do, but it takes a while. So we've been working on this for a little while too.
And
but
we had a head
still have
start.
a little more.
We had a head start on the Linux side.
It's true. Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because when we started the Linux version of things, we intentionally said we want to build on Linux with common tools, not internal Microsoft goop.
Well, we were already kind of planning to go open source at that time too. That was a couple of years ago. So we said, all right, let's keep this part as clean as possible, so then when we do get to the point where we can open source, it won't be quite so hard. So that worked out okay, but the Windows side will still take a little longer.
The next question.
So a quick follow-up to this question. There is this KT logger and list layer that are kernel drivers. Do you plan to move them outside of the kernel in Windows version of Service Fabric, or how do you plan to handle that we need to build kernel drivers and sign them somehow to have a custom Service Fabric build?
Yeah, at this point, there was an initiative a long time ago to make sure that they always ran in user mode, but we haven't exercised it in a while. On Linux, they do run in user mode, so that's a way to test right now. In the meantime, I think there's no immediate plans to move them kind of permanently out. I do have a machine that I keep permanently in test mode so I can load unsigned drivers, but we get that that's not a great option for everybody. So I'd say you can do the testing on Linux today, because when they build as user mode modules there. This is probably something that we're going to work on sorting out. Another option is containerization, so that your host machine doesn't have to be polluted with all this stuff. There's a few different ways we're going to try and tackle it.
Yeah, we don't have a full answer to that.
Yeah, not a great
good
one.
question.
Yeah. Roadmap for containers in Service Fabric?
Yes, we should talk about some of the things that are now in our current release and then what's coming up in the next release.
The current release as in
the one that's just going
the
to
next
1.6.1.
release,
It's always good to recap some of that.
Okay.
But anyway,
let me actually talk about some of the things that we are working on for 6.2, which is going to be released in the upcoming weeks, so in the next month or two, next couple of months. So a whole lot of effort has been into providing you with better diagnostics and error messages. So, if something actually fails, you can actually see what's going on. So there's been a lot of investment into making sure that the Service Fabric Explorer error messages are more helpful and help you are actionable, so you can actually find the root of the problem.
things like I can't find the certificate, or the image failed to download, or
things that we even do not, like for example, we do say, hey, the operating system does not support containers, so all of them will have more, kindler, gentler error messages, so to speak. Another big thing that's coming in is you will have the ability to debug containers on Service Fabric on Windows 10. So that integration people have been asking for a long time, so you'll get it with 6.2. Furthermore, a lot of tweaks, for example, we are also letting you pass custom Docker daemon settings. So you can actually set that now on the cluster, so a lot more configurability. With 6.1, we let you look at logs on containers through SFX and through CLI. With 6.2, we are actually taking one step further because what happens often is the containers crash on launch and, I don't have the container anymore, so how do I actually look at logs? So we will actually let you get logs from dead containers. One, we will let you persist dead containers that are no longer running, so we won't actually remove it, so it's still there. And secondly, we will actually let you even see the logs from dead containers. More goodness that is coming in terms of diagnostics is we are also going to let you remotely attach into containers. So it's essentially the equivalent of, hey, if you were to log into the node and then remotely attach into the container and run some command there, say for example some docker exe command or something like that, we will actually let you do this from the CLI, so you can actually say, hey, give me a command session so I can actually run commands inside my container. Couple of other things that are also coming down the pike. Running Service Fabric services inside containers on Windows will GA in the upcoming months. So we've had it in preview for a while. So we are making some improvements in terms of how to package it better, but that's also coming down. And finally,
isolated networks in the next release?
Isolated networks will. Isolated risk, we are trying to get it in the next release, but it's possible that it might slip to the release after that.
Okay, that means okay.
The things that I'm talking about, pretty much, you should see it all in the next release. Then we are also going to have a built-in, or rather, we'll provide you with a way to deploy an Azure Files volume driver. Again, something people have been asking us for. So we'll provide an application, just like batch orchestration application, that you can deploy, and now you have an Azure Files volume driver, which you can, which your containers can use now. And furthermore, there are more improvements in the secrets management story, so we'll let you pass secrets via environment variables into containers as well. So that's kind of a subset of things that I can think of the top of my head for containers that is coming in 6.2. So a whole lot of features coming in.
Yeah, I think the big point is lots and lots of diagnostics, big focus on getting containers working, and we're driving the Windows container team hard.
Yeah. Lots of usability fixes.
Yes. As Windows containers gets better, you can help thank us.
Yeah. And of course, as Mark mentioned, like in the long
pressure on
in the longer term, isolated networks will be there, so each application will be in its own isolated network. So all of those things will also be coming in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is around a project we have called Seabreeze. I would just say if you want to find out more about that, join the Gamma Advisors Forum.
Yep.
That's where we now make all the announcements about that project.
Can you put
that's
instructions?
So Damir is already in Azure Advisors.
Sure.
So that's perfect.
Yes.
And then I'll add a link as to how they can join.
Do we want to put the preview link in there? No?
Well,
Alright.
Yeah. If you want to join our Azure Advisors Forum, we'll talk about that. That's what we should do there.
Fine.
Thanks, man.
I don't know.
Okay, hey all, I mentioned those Stack Overflow.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one since I've already had part of a conversation. So the question is, hey, I have a really busy service where there's going to be lots of things in a queue or really in any collection, and this eats up a lot of RAM. Is there an option maybe in the future to skip RAM and use disk so that I take a perf hit, but I don't generate lots of garbage and eat tons of room in RAM? That's a reasonable option. On the whole, on the collections, we're trying to do more options like this in terms of mixing and matching. So for example, some folks want collections that are only in RAM and they don't want to pay the persistence cost. Some folks want to persist, but you can persist lazily, and so you get some perf back, but you keep some measure of safety. And you want to, for example, go only to disk and not eat memory because the perf isn't as critical, but the space consumption is. So these are all options, and we've already got some knobs that tweak some of this, but generally the collections were built very strictly with always in memory, with some least recently used caching, so that if you don't touch an item for a while, there's a chance it'll get compacted and flushed out just so that it's on disk. But as it is today, there's really only like these one or two modes of operation. So what we're going to do is kind of flesh that out and make sure that all the different options are available. There's no strict timeline on when that would show up. Probably the in-memory only one would actually be what would show up first, because that's a long-standing ask from a lot of folks who don't, can't pay for the perf hit of going to disk and are willing to give up on that safety because it's ephemeral data. But then we'll go and put back in the option to skip memory and mainly keep things on the drives. We're also going to be exposing more controls around that least recently used cache and flushing things out, and extending that to the rest of the data structures. Today, I think it only works for the collections, for the dictionaries. So there's a bunch of improvements coming here. Yours is definitely on the list, but it's going to be a little while before everything shows up.
Okay.
Are the recordings from these Q&As available? Yeah, they're all public on YouTube. I think somebody linked already.
Yes, Mark's going to post,
I'll post the link
to this.
Vladimir asked if there's any documentation on the expected supported ingress egress rates for the different collections. There isn't, because it's highly variable based on the hardware. So we should get, I'm not disagreeing, like we should have a benchmark on some particular piece of common hardware and publish those numbers. As it is, if you search for, if somebody can link in, there's a set of tests that we publish, like a performance test sample. You can grab that and run it on the environment that you have in mind, kind of with the configuration that you have in mind, and see what performance you get. I want to be very clear that those tests are going to give you a min bar, right? So your performance will be usually no worse than what that sample shows. The sample does not do a lot of things that we would recommend for peak performance, so it doesn't have custom serialization, it doesn't use the reliable concurrent queues, it doesn't give you control over the transport. So all those things are things that we'd recommend you do if you're really going for the best performance characteristics. But again, it does serve as a min bar to kind of get you started and see roughly where the performance numbers would fall for your workload, and then gives you there's pointers to see what you would go tweak in order to more accurately map your workload to that test. So it's a min bar, and we should have benchmarks, something like that eventually. That's something we just have to kind of go do.
So there's a question about, is there plans to have JSON format configurations instead of XML? Yeah, we're actually working on that right now. Still kind of in design phase, but we're working on some prototypes that part of it is also simplifying the experience you have with application manifest and service manifest, and kind of focusing, we're trying to make it focus more on just kind of simple application development. So for example, without having to necessarily define application types and then worry about instances and default services, we're trying to kind of smooth a lot of that over, and then also change the format away from XML to JSON and YAML. So that's coming.
Yes,
Yep.
That'd be a good thing. So do you have any recommendations on the DL setup for Service Fabric? I mean, read about one or two suggestions that come out, set up 2 instances in 2 regions or span across regions.
So this question really depends upon what level of HADR you're really looking for. Particularly, there's terms RPO and RTO, recovery point objective, which is how far back in time, how much data can you lose, and recovery time objective, how long does it take you to get back up and running after something happens. I've actually written a pretty good guide on this that kind of lays some of these out. Whether or not you go for 2 regions or a span cluster will depend upon a few things. One is, I would normally personally say I like multi-region clusters, but lots of Azure regions do not have 3 availability zones. Lots of geographic, geopolitical areas don't have 3 Azure regions in them. And so you're kind of hamstrung where you can't reasonably set up a 3-region or 3 AZ cluster. So in those cases, you kind of have to fall back to the 2 regions and then doing some sort of active backup and restore sync across them. Backup and restore is simpler to get up and running. It's simpler to operate, and it's usually kind of how people are used to doing things. The downside is that you don't get that really perfect automated, aiming for 0 RPO RTO. You have to punch some button and figure out when to restore and when to fail over and when to fail back. The cool thing about the multi-site one is that all of that is automated because it's just like failover normally. The downside is it's more complicated to set up. It's usually more costly to run because you're syncing traffic all over the place, and it can have a bigger performance impact on the workload. So it really does depend on the particulars of what you're trying to survive, what types of failures you're trying to survive, and what those recovery numbers kind of need to be.
The one I would point to is that certainly with availability zones, which is where you have multiple data centers within a particular region, we're working quite rapidly to get an official template out for that one in the coming months, because we've been testing that for a while, and availability zones is itself in preview and going to be GA. So when they GA, we want to be there with a template that you can use to have at least disaster recovery at a greater level than just a single data center.
Yeah, and I put a link in at the bottom there for the current disaster recovery guide that you can take a look at, and it kind of steps you through how to think about some of these things.
And I'll add a link to the template that exists for.
And Mark beat me.
Yeah, yes.
Sorry.
I credited you.
Yes.
By Matt.
Well, it says it at the top too, but that's cool. Thank you. But yeah, that should get you started.
Okay, next question was, I think, about Linux workloads. Yes, it was.
Yep. So yeah, our understanding is that 30% of Azure services run on Service Fabric, but we assume that the services are based on Windows clusters. How many teams at Microsoft are actually using Service Fabric on Linux? So yes, you are right, because most of Microsoft's first-party services are actually running on Windows. So they are using Windows clusters, the vast majority of them. Now, in terms of the number of teams at Microsoft, so most of the first-party services are built on Windows, but some of them are now actually trying Linux for some of their internal services. So we do have dozens of teams actually using Service Fabric on Linux, or building small services or prototyping it. But most of the at-scale services in Microsoft are running on Windows clusters.
Yeah, and I think that's
probably
a historical
be.
basis, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future. But yeah, nothing too surprising there. Question on replace reverse proxy with a Windows-based version of Envoy. Does this let me get an app gateway? All sorts of neat stuff.
Yes. Let me find it real quick here.
It's from Wit.
It said there was a thread indicating they have
There it is.
replace the reverse proxy with Envoy.
Yeah, so there's a couple things we're doing. So there's reverse proxy, which is that's one we have today. The Envoy-based version that would just be the same. It's the same functionality, but we're using Envoy there so that we can run it on Linux, because the Windows one is built on the Windows HTTP API. But beyond that, we're doing a little more work, which is building out a full service mesh, and that includes an Ingress part. So the Ingress part is what we're working on first, because that's the part that will allow you to configure traffic routing into your services from external without having to write your own stateless gateway in front. And I think that's kind of the biggest pain point right now, is always having to write that stupid gateway service in front of everything. So we want to provide that service based on Envoy Proxy and make that configurable. So that's coming first. The rest of the mesh will follow, and that's basically also adding Envoy sidecars along to your services, so that even for inter-service communication, you can make use of the proxies to do things like partition resolution, rate limiting, all kinds of goodness, and of course logging and diagnostics, and building out an application map that you can view based on how traffic is flowing. All kinds of goodness there. So it's in progress. We're still working on that. The Windows port of Envoy is also in progress. That's up on GitHub too, actually, if you want to take a look at that, or if you're interested in helping us do that port, that's up there. So let's see, and it'd be particularly good if I could have a Service Fabric aware load balancer. Right, so the idea here is the Envoy Ingress proxy would essentially be that Service Fabric aware load balancer. That's a layer 7 thing, so it would still sit behind a layer 4 load balancer, like the Azure load balancer, for example, which is just taking traffic on a VIP and forwarding it off to the VMs behind. But the VMs that are behind the Azure load balancer would then have the Envoy proxy sitting on them, and they could route from there. There is an opportunity to actually, you could potentially stand up that Ingress proxy in place of the Azure load balancer. That's something that is possible. We're not really planning it that way right now, but it's something that you could set up yourself if you really wanted to.
Or I would use it that way on-prem.
You definitely, you could use it that way on-prem for sure, yeah. The tricky part, of course, would be you'd have to you'd have to set up your domain names with multiple IPs and then track it that way. So even on-prem, an F5 load balancer is probably still a good idea.
Yeah.
So all that's still in progress, but we should see, at least hopefully within the next few months, I think, we should start to see something light up there.
Yep.
Yeah, and in the meanwhile, I did a plug for traffic as another reverse proxy.
Yeah, that's another one good one that works pretty well today.
Yeah, and we got an article coming out in the next few days on our team blog, just to kind of give more context to that. That Johnny wrote for us, who actually did that integration with traffic.
Wendy Morris. Yeah.
All right, the documentation was about default services.
You skipped.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Any update on the scheduling option? Yeah, we haven't. Yes. We have some old scheduling code that sits still in Service Fabric that we're talking about reviving and seeing if we want to use that, or if we want to kind of do it better than that. We built that for an internal partner a long time ago, so it's kind of there, and we can revive it and bring it up, or we can do a better one that's a little bit more like a calendar scheduling. It's under discussion, but there's no work going on at this point. We know it's a common ask, but we haven't reached a conclusion on how we want to go about it yet. So no news, but we understand that that's a common one.
Documentation is the case of default services. And it says, are they there largely for easy demonstration and setup of the cluster and local development, and setup of the cluster, and that in the larger picture. So basically, should I use default services or PowerShell scripts?
And so what we see is when you get to sort of like real production applications where you need more control over how services are created, that's where default services kind of stop being useful, because they're embedded into the application type itself, which means that every time you create an application, the services within the application are always created the same way, and you don't really have any flexibility to change that. So it's useful for just kind of getting up and started, or for the Visual Studio tooling, it's useful because it allows us to attach a debugger really easily, because we always know what's going to get created. But when you're building out a CI/CD pipeline, or you're creating architectures where, say, for example, you need to create new services sort of on the fly, which means that you launch an application, but you don't necessarily create the services yet. You might be waiting for, say, a customer to come along, and when the customer signs up for your product, you create a service instance for them. So if you're using default services, that's pretty much impossible to do. And that's where you'd want to actually create services the programmatic way, or the command line way, rather than the declarative way, which is what you do in default services. So usually what we see is you kind of graduate from default services to actually using command line, or just using C# and creating services yourself programmatically. It's the same set of parameters. It's just that instead of specifying it in XML, you're just doing it through command line.
Right. So like, instead of, if I wanted to add a new service into my environment, I don't have to go upgrade the application in order to do that. I can just call the API.
Right.
And we see that maps a lot more naturally to the types of workloads that people typically end up running on Service Fabric, but the default services are still there just as a getting started kind of quick F5 thing. Even on F5 now, though, the tooling has changed so that in the scripts folder, you can add another script called start-service.ps1. I think one of the samples that I've worked on does it. That lets you get rid of the default services and have that full manual control over what services get created and how they get created and how many of them get created and all that stuff. We're working on enhancing that tooling so it's a little more straightforward. I think also in the new model of the new kind of application and services model, a lot of this gets cleaner.
Yes, that question earlier about is there a JSON Alternative XML? So part of that work is sort of cleaning this up a little bit, making it a little less confusing about, because right now there are kind of two different ways you can work with creating services. There's default services and there's the scripts. So we're kind of cleaning that up a little bit, make it a little more obvious that this is really the best way to do it. And so the kind of the JSON YAML version of this will steer you in that direction a little bit more. There's still a declarative format that you can use,
which is nice.
Which is really good, because you want the declarative format. You want to say, here's my config. This is how I want you to instantiate and run the service. Cool. But you want to be able to run that as a command programmatically. So now you can have a declarative thing that goes through your CI/CD pipeline, or you do things on the fly. So it kind of mixes the best of both worlds. So that's the direction we're heading into. I would say for now, stick to using the PowerShell commands or the SF CLI or the C# APIs to create the service instances. You'll get a lot more flexibility that way, and it'll work better in your build environment.
Yeah, I like it because it's low magic, right?
Yeah, there's no magic there. It's all very explicit.
Very right in your face about what's going on and where the service names come from and all that stuff.
Exactly.
It's very clear.
Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.
I'm not too sure the answer to the next one. This one on publish profile.
So publish. So you're asking for an upsert option. Is that? Are you asking? You want to set the upgrade domain or upgrade deployment enabled, but the first time you want it to create, and subsequent times you want it to upgrade. Is that kind of what you're getting at with upsert?
I think that's
yeah, that's the idea. Like by default, it's included now, and I'm having to flip it back and forth.
Yeah.
I'd have to check. I don't know if we have that option. If you do set it to upgrade deployment, the first time it'll fail, right? Because there's nothing to upgrade, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think that
But
option.
I'm having to go in and like change source control, and I'm wondering if
that's kind
just
of
over time how that's going to work.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Good question.
Good ask.
Yeah. Good
Yeah.
ask. Let's make a note
of that.
and we'll get back to you. Ask us next month.
That's optimistic.
It's okay.
I'll make a note of that.
In the meantime,
I don't think it's
I
there,
think
but
at
it's
one
something
point
we
I
should-
hacked deploy
Thanks.
to handle this. At one point,
You could. Yeah, that's true. You could.
I know that at one point I went into deploy service fabric application.ps1, which is the script that's included in the VS tooling, and I added a check specifically for this so that I could leave it as upgraded. And basically, if there wasn't an app that was already there, it skipped from the upgrade path back into the create path. So it's a hack, but that's why we give you the script. So when we screw up like this, you can just go change it. I know that that's not ideal either, because now you're diverging from the official deployment script, but that's something that's not going to run normally as a part of your real production deployment environment anyway. So hack it up, change it as you need.
Yeah, that's probably the best.
Okay, I can take a look.
Yeah, take a look, and if you make that change and it's not working the way you expect, I think that's a good candidate for a feature fix.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, we're using GMSA accounts to run Service Fabric to connect to a database, and really the question is should we run all our processes and services, I should say, underneath different accounts as opposed to not run them accounts, so that we can do authentication calls between all the different services between them. And this is all on premise, by the way. This is presumably running on premise. The GSMA feature on premise with Active Directory, I think it's a wonderful feature that you can really have control of where the service, the process it runs under, is all part of a group managed service account. And I would tend to recommend this if that's the way you want to go, because it provides another level of security, and because it's so straightforward to be able to do this on premise. It kind of depends on how paranoid you are. If you just have sort of the Ingress proxy and you do all the checking there, and then behind that sort of proxy, you're happy that the calls can go between any one of your services, and that that level of authentication, that's fine. But if you can run all your services under different accounts, it provides that next level of security depth that I certainly would go to. The cost is no more than the fact that every call that comes to you has to be authenticated back to Active Directory that's running. So that's the additional cost that you'll get. I can't really speak to the performance cost that would impact, but you'd have to authenticate all your calls. I presume it will have an impact on performance, but I don't know off the top of my head what that would be. So yes, I would tend to go this direction.
We saw some funky behavior when we were calling from one service out to the externally exposed web API. So we had two microservices on the same cluster, and we were calling back outside the cluster to get back in, and saw some issues. We weren't sure what they were. So then we started doing direct microservice to microservice calls. And the question more becomes like, as you get into an enterprise area where you want to say, hey, you're supposed to be calling this or that, and you're actually routing the traffic from the use of your web services, not routing the traffic, but keeping track of who's calling which web services, and having sort of a subscription, hey, you're expecting 50,000 calls a month, but all of a sudden you're taking 150,000 calls or things along those lines. That's sort of where I could see service provisioning and keeping track of the management of who's, which internal customers are using which web services, et cetera. But I didn't know if it would come at a big cost. I don't mind just using network service if it's just not a database call. But from what you're saying, from the cluster perspective, it's the same authentication you'd have for AD, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean that's what those are. Yes, I mean the GSMA accounts are all just I'm running this particular service. The processor is underneath the credentials for that particular account. Yes, so it just provides another level of security so that you don't just run it under a general account. I mean, like you don't want to run them all under admin. It's just they by default run under network service. You can run them under a GSMA account, and now you can include that account, and that's so any calls into that will be authenticated, really.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
What's next? What's a recommended pattern for upgrading service for a cluster in Azure with large changes, like moving to Windows 2016 with containers, or accelerating networking that would need a new scale set? Is there a way to add 2 scale sets to the same service for every cluster?
Oh yeah. So normally for this disruptive stuff, the safest way to do it ever in production is always to add the entire new VM scale set into the existing cluster, move all the services over by updating their placement constraints, and then getting rid of the old VM scale set. That works well for anything but the primary node type, because that's where the system services sit. So hopefully you've already got the primary node type separated out from where your services run. If not, it can be a little more involved and it's a little more nail-bitey because you have to move the system services around. It works and works in the same pattern, but it is a little trickier to do. There is a guide that talks about changing things like the VM SKU that sits up in our docs around, I think it's called like planning cluster capacity or something like that. And it walks you through what roughly you have to do in case you ever want to change this stuff. So generally we don't recommend trying to change it in place. And from an infrastructure level, as you mentioned, some things Azure won't even let you change in place. You kind of have to create a whole new scale set. So like if you're not just changing SKUs of Windows, if you're going across offers, which is a weird barrier that exists for some reason. I don't honestly understand why it's there, but it's there. If you're changing across offers, you can't do it in place. Even if you could do it in place, changing in place is also scary because Azure generally doesn't know how to go backwards in case anything bad starts to happen. And so most changes in place can be destructive. And that's also scary because there's no way to stop it once it starts to kind of percolate through your cluster. So we like to see a whole new VM scale set come up, everything gets in, your tests are run, everything looks good, you move the services over, and then you can get rid of the old VM scale set. That's kind of the pattern that we recommend. So if you can go that way, then that's fine. And yeah, it's totally normal to have multiple VM scale sets, multiple node types in the same cluster. So that's what we'd recommend. In my app, I have actors that chat to a stateful services using remoting. Service proxy factory is expensive, so I'm currently solving this by caching the service proxy factory in a custom actor service and then referencing service proxy factory from that actor. Is that okay to do? It should be okay to do.
That's fine. You can do it that way. And you're right. The factory is the expensive thing, so you definitely want to make sure you only have one instance of that running around. The other way you can do it, what I usually do is I will create it at the process host level, so like in your program main, and then you can create an instance there, and then when you do the register service type or register actor service type, you can add a Lambda method to that registration, which is that Lambda method is basically allowing you to plug things into the constructor of your service instance, or in the case of actors, into your individual actor instances. So what you can do is you can create an instance of the factory up front in program main and then inject that instance in through the constructor of your actor. So then every actor gets an instance of it through its constructor that way, but they're all sharing the same instance. So that's another way to do it. Doing it in the service is fine too. The only difference though is that if you do it in the service, if you're using the shared hosting model, which means that service instances of that same actor service type, you can have multiple of those in the same process. That means each one will get its own factory, versus if you inject it from the host level, every service instance will use the same one. So there's no right or wrong way. As long as you're not creating a huge number of service instances, which you're probably not, then it's fine to do it just in the service. But either way, it'll work.
All right. So, Ben.
Ben. Hey, Ben. So you open source 19 hours ago, are the top trending repository on GitHub, and already have 851 stars and 85 forks. Early hours, but how do you think it's gone so far? Is that what you're expecting?
Massive high fives to everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the reception's been great, actually. 851 stars, maybe a little more than we were expecting, but we weren't quite sure exactly what to expect. But it's great. I think it's fantastic that a lot of people have taken notice and are at least interested in the project. I'm not surprised there aren't too many forks because it's a massive code base. But it is really great to see that kind of interest, and that's good news for us. That allows us to, that kind of gives us validation that, yeah, this is a good thing and we should keep up the momentum. So we'll do that for sure. Pretty cool though.
And we already had our first PR by our very own Marcin, who's on the call.
Thank you, Marcin.
Marcin was the first external guy to upload a PR and cleaned up some of our garbage that we left hanging around. So it's working.
There's probably quite a bit of that issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's an 8-year-old code base. There's going to be stuff in there that we forgot about.
I want to be a code deleter of the month.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're more than welcome, sir.
Yeah, any dead code you find in there, please wipe it out. It's good. I don't want to be one of the largest open source projects if they're all garbage lines of code. If they're all useful, then we should keep them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really, we've been talking about this as it's been leading up to happening, and I am very giddy.
Yes, we're very excited about this. This is good.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, GMSA in the application manifest. The application manifest did use GMSA to have the principles and policies set up, but our security team doesn't want to add all of the developer boxes to the machine group to use these GMSAs. That means in my CI/CD pipeline, doing a file replacement due to the password I've been set up, being there when GSMA is not used is an easy way.
I thought that should be injectable as an application parameter, so you don't have to drop a new file on top. But I don't remember if we made that one overridable. So I would check doing it via an application parameter and then injecting that. So you pull the secret down from somewhere and then inject it as an application parameter, encrypt it and inject it. That should work. If it doesn't, then that's another thing that we're going to be improving, where a lot of these things become overridable by default.
Yeah.
In the new model.
Yeah.
Versus us having to specifically in the schema say what is overridable and where it can come from.
Yeah, much easier way.
Something else here, because we're in the process. And here's just I'll do it, but sort of side question. Another way of solving this problem is we were looking at doing just config transformations and using slow cheetah or something like that to do a replace on that whole on the whole XML element itself. To do config transformations like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that was another approach we'd looked at. Right now, I'm having to do a file copy.
If it's a valid file, we don't know how you generated it. So
yeah, it's a build time thing. So we don't really care. Like the platform is not going to care. We're at the end of that pipeline. You're handing us an XML file, and it's either valid or it's not.
Yep.
So it's fine. The difference between that and like doing it through application parameters is that we have a way to then go and update those application parameters through the system.
Right.
What you're basically doing is you're doing it even before that at build time, saying, okay, I've done some transformation, I've done some replacements. Here's my final XML. We don't know that you've done those things, so we just run it as is, and that's fine to do.
Right. So right now I'm just doing a file copy. I was having a problem getting Slow Cheetah working. Do you know of other people using Slow Cheetah with Service Fabric and it does work correctly?
I don't.
No,
I don't know of anyone.
I don't know of anyone.
Okay, I can take a look at that. But so right now, because when the GMSA, you don't have a password option, and when you do, when you go back to the normal username and password, that password XML data element is inside, and it seems like that's causing an issue. Otherwise, I just use application parameters. I believe it is overridable as far as the actual username itself, but the fact that password exists, I think, is causing the issue.
Great.
Okay, I'll take a look. Right now, we're doing file replace. I just went through a whole CI/CD, and I just wanted to thank you guys one more time for all your help. We're finally, after like a year year and a half of toying with Service Fabric, deploying to production this week. So I just wanted to say thank you.
All right, best of luck. We're here to help, so let us know what you need.
Perfect. All right, guys. 10-minute
10-minute
time check.
Okay.
Lightning round.
Lightning round.
Yeah,
All right. Marcin, yes, the KTL logger is the log that I mentioned. It does have basic things around data tiering baked into it, but nothing yet. We're really just trying to sort out the in-memory on-disk layering first, and then we'll start talking about other disks and remote things, but that's the basic there.
Marcin, I can't find Envoy for Service Fabric. I've just posted you the link to the repo of where it is.
Yeah, it's in the Microsoft repo. It's a separate thing.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah. Traffic, yep, also does pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, app config, CI/CD.NET Core. We are able to get the app settings JSON file moved over to the application parameter file, but we're still doing rename app.config.
Can you get the XD to look at the application parameter? Yeah, I mean,
I don't think so because they're different formats.
Yeah.
Weird. I don't know if that would work.
You might be able to do one of those config loader things.
Yeah. But again, these are different. These are again different things we're talking about because the app, the exe config. I mean, that's read by the process. The application parameter, again, that's kind of a Service Fabric concept, which is overridable then later through upgrades. So they're kind of two separate things. I would keep them separate.
Samir asks, will you provide a more cost-effective API gateway service? So I presume you're saying in so many words, API management is really expensive. We know that. That's good feedback for the API management team. The best we're going to be able to do is cut some of this routing mesh stuff that we're building.
Yeah, so that's basically the service mesh. So service mesh will give you that Ingress configuration, which is, it's not going to be as rich as API management, obviously, but it'll give you at least the basic layer 7 HTTP routing stuff. So for example, routing host names and URL paths to different services and mapping those out to IP addresses. So all that stuff will be there, plus a little bit extra.
Yeah. But like custom DNS name or DNS names,
you gotta register your DNS
all that stuff is still going to have to come from something like App Gateway or API management. Victor says we're planning to use SF for containers on Linux. How dedicated are we to Linux? We're pretty dedicated.
You're hurting me.
Yeah.
By asking that question.
You just tore down Manny's entire career.
Yeah. That's how dedicated I am.
So
what we're saying is, what percentage of our resources are dedicated to containers Linux? We build everything so that we have 3 principles. We build everything that it runs on Windows and Linux, first class. The order may be timing wise. You see some things on Windows first and then Linux and the other way around, but we aim to get them both. And also we also make sure that everything runs on standalone on premise as well.
Yeah, so the notion, I mean, there's a few people who are dedicated to like the Linux build environment and things like that. Yeah. But there's no dedicated team for Linux because it has to work on both.
Every feature has to work on all SKUs.
Yeah.
So
is a 100% of the team?
Yeah, it's one code base. So we don't build things just for Windows or just for Linux.
Yeah.
And now
ordering, there may be ordering just because
like networking
just because different stacks.
HTTP is different. Like there's all sorts of little things that are different around I/O.
There are things in the Linux kernel we can do with regards to IP tables that we can't do in Windows yet. So those will light up on Linux first and then come to Windows later. Stuff like that. But yeah, like Manny said, it's one team. We're working on one product, and it's on both Linux and Windows.
So what's the chance that we will drop support for containers Linux and tell people to use AKS? Zero. 0%
That
chance.
will not happen.
If it's possible to have a negative percentage chance, then it would be that. But yeah, we're spending a lot of time on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for allowing us to reiterate that we are really committed to containers on Linux.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there more nuanced examples of how to transition off default services to scripted service creation?
We have some sample code that shows you how to do the latter, which is create services just through script or through C#.
Yeah,
So those are up there.
I don't know if there's
not really a guide.
If you had it
necessarily,
deployed with default services, I don't know that there's a good guide for moving from one to the other. I think we just say, rip it down and place it. Most people don't make it to prod with default services still in. But if you needed that transition, you have to be very careful because when you delete the default services from the manifest, you're telling Service Fabric to delete your services. This is another reason why they're very weird. So there is certainly a way to do it. We've walked a few people through it, but I don't think we've written up the exact transition guide. If you're not worried about downtime, if you're not already in prod, I would say just rip them out and go with the scripted one. if all the parameters transfer over, it's really just, there's a few, I think the health metrics data aggregation sample has the scripted one.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Start with something like that and just look at how all the translations. If it is in prod and you need help doing it without causing yourself downtime, you would open up a issue on our GitHub issues list, and we can work through the steps probably in the test environment to make sure we don't stomp on anything. Okay.
Oliver.
No replacement constraints.
Is the priority given to type 1 given? No, there is no order. It's an incomplete statement. So the entire statement must match. It would be the same thing as if it was A or B or anything like that. Yeah, the whole expression is evaluated on a per node basis. You can think of it that way. It's not 50-50 chance. It's based on all the other things that are true in the cluster. So the rest of load balancing switches.
It's just one big Boolean expression.
Yeah.
So we evaluate it.
It is any of those nodes are valid, and then which one it lands on is based on a whole bunch of other stuff.
It's just things like upgrades aren't exactly clear.
I don't know what that's in relation to. I mean, sure, in general, I agree with you. There's all sorts of weird stuff in upgrades, but maybe clarify what part of upgrades is not working for you.
I thought it meant to do with moving from default services to contribute. Okay, I thought it was related to the same question.
Yeah, it might be, sure. Okay. Yeah, that process is tricky with default services specifically because you're baking instance level stuff into your type information, and that's why it's all wonky.
I think
which is why we generally try to advise away from that, because that's where it gets weird. If you do it all programmatically or through script, then it's pretty clear, because you're just doing it one way. But when you start mixing those two together, then it does get a little
you're mixing imperative and declarative, and the declarative is in type instances, and it's very strange.
Yeah, a bit of a plug here to Maxime, who's one of our cloud developer advocates. If you and Anthony Chu as well, if there's anything that you write that you want them to kind of amplify more, drop them a tweet or send them an email, drop them a tweet, and they'll be more than happy to amplify your message. Yeah, that's what they're there for.
So I'll answer one of these in reverse order. Does Service Fabric's upgrade stuff work with the built-in VSTS deployment set? Yeah, inside VSTS, there's actually a task called Service Fabric PowerShell that you can do anything, and that's where we'd expect you to put the dynamic service creation. To Greg's earlier question, that's also where you could do things like determine if this service is already there and whether or not you want to upgrade it, and which ones you want to create after you finish the deployment and all that sort of stuff. That's where all of that would sit. So there's a specific task for it. Steve asked the question, what percentage of Azure services sit on top of Service Fabric? Well, as we mentioned, it's about a third of Azure's cores overall run Service Fabric in some form. That includes, Cosmos DB, SQL Azure, Intune, Dynamics 365.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of new ones.
IoT Hub, Event Hub, Event Grid.
I mean, ones we've added recently are Archive Storage, Azure Container Registry. All of the databases do now. The PostgreSDB, MariaDB, Stream Analytics does. Most of the database stuff does really. HD Insight is moving over to it. They weren't.
Stream Analytics is also moving.
So I've never really counted up the number, and it's difficult because also there's a whole bunch of other services internally that are not public facing that run on things that provide supporting services.
Yeah, so sometimes we have to tease those numbers apart.
Yeah, it's the services, like the actual services that you use. That's probably most of them.
Most of them.
The actual cores, the number of cores that are running Service Fabric is about a third.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cores obviously are like VMs, which is just a VM. But the thing that provisions those VMs is also Service Fabric.
Right.
Service Fabric
so I mean, that's the other thing worth mentioning is that in Azure now there's this notion of resource providers, which is you come to Azure and you ask for a VM, or you come and you ask for a network. Most of those services, a lot of those services around compute, networking, storage. Those resource provider services, the core of Azure, run on top of Service Fabric.
But it's a good question, and what I shall do is I'll actually go around and get the official number of what they all are and figure it all out and do that. I've been gathering all together recently. But yes, bunch in the database, all side of things. So, I'll publish a new slide with the updated set.
Yeah, Marcin mentions Cortana. That's one that runs outside of Azure today, but it is another Microsoft service that runs heavily on top of Service Fabric.
There's things in Office 365 as well.
We're all over the place. Yeah. Scratch a service.
Yes.
Okay.
Whit asked one final question. Yes, just bookkeeping wise, this is the early one. The next one's in 6 hours or so.
4:30.
Yeah.
4:30?
4:30 or 4? No, 4:30. 4:30.
4:30?
Yes.
Okay.
Really? We moved it half an hour out?
Yeah, I had to. Couldn't get the room.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
there you go.
Or 4:30 PST time, which
Now we
is. Yes.
Go to the blog, grab the link.
Yeah.
It'll put it on your calendar in the correct time zone. I'm not going to try and do the math.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you got.
But thank you, everybody. I think
I
we're,
think it's 11. Oh, wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
time's up.
Goes by so fast.
Awesome. Yeah, it did. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.
See you on GitHub.
Happy Open Source Day.
Happy
Ah.
Open Source Day.
And we'll get the end
We
of
just
life.
stole Pi Day from.
Yeah, it's okay. We'll see you all soon.
Friday.
Yesterday was Pi Day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.